There are worlds in this galaxy where children are taught to strip and reassemble a lasgun before they learn to read. Where the sound of artillery becomes a lullaby and the tremor of orbital bombardment feels like the pulse of a sleeping giant, Cadia was such a world. A fortress carved from stone and hatred, positioned at the mouth of hell itself. Every soul born beneath its violet skies knew that death was not a possibility, but a certainty. The only question was how long they could delay it. In the final days before the world cracked apart, there existed outposts scattered across the galaxy like seeds from a dying tree. These were places where Cadian regiments held positions that had been forgotten by commanders who were themselves forgotten by history. Remote stations where the war against chaos continued in silence, fought by soldiers who had never known peace and would never live to see it. One such outpost was designated Tertius 77 Alpha, a communications relay buried in the frozen wastes of Colossus Prime, a dead world on the rim of Imperial space. The facility itself was unremarkable. Reinforced concrete and ceramite, built to withstand nuclear bombardment and equipped with Vox arrays that could pierce the warp storms plaguing the sector. What made it significant was not its strategic value, but the men and women who defended it. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops had been deployed to Tertius 77 Alpha 3 years before the destruction of their homeworld. 43 soldiers from a regiment that had once numbered in the thousands. They were the remnants of campaigns fought on worlds whose names had been struck from Imperial records. Veterans of sieges that lasted decades and retreats that spanned solar systems. They had been stationed at the relay because High Command believed they were spent, used up. Suitable only for garrison duty on a world where nothing ever happened. High Command was wrong. The squad leader was a woman named Cassa Verin. She had been born in the shadow of the Cadian Gate, in a hab block that shook with the thunder of void shields whenever the despoilers' fleets tested the system's defenses. Her first memory was the taste of recaf mixed with promethium fumes. Her second was the weight of a lasgun in her 6-year-old hands. By the time she reached her 13th birthday, she could strip, clean, and reassemble the weapon blindfolded in under 2 minutes. This was not considered exceptional. On Cadia, it was simply expected. Verin had violet eyes, not the pale lavender that marked some Cadians as touched by the warp's proximity, but deep purple shot through with flecks of silver. Eyes that had seen the birth and death of stars through the scope of a long las. Eyes that had watched friends die with the same expression they might wear while checking ammunition counts. When she smiled, which was rarely, it never reached those eyes. They remained fixed on some distant horizon where enemies waited in numbers too vast to count. Her second in command was Sergeant Jorik Thane, a man whose skin bore the ritual scars of the Cadian Youth Corps. Raised in the Khazar-Galan military academies, he had been trained from birth to serve as an officer. The scars on his forearms told the story of his progression through the ranks. Each mark represented a test passed, a skill mastered, a weakness overcome. The largest scar, running from his left wrist to his elbow, had been earned during the trial of Iron Resolve. For 72 hours he had been buried alive in a coffin barely large enough to contain his body. Food and water were provided through a tube. Waste was removed through another. The test was not physical endurance, but mental fortitude. Many candidates broke within the first day, screaming to be released. Thane had emerged after 3 days with his sanity intact and his faith in the Emperor unshaken. The rest of the squad represented a cross-section of Cadian society. There was Mila Corvin, a former factory worker from the industrial zones who could repair any piece of Imperial technology with little more than a wrench and profanity. Beside her stood Marcus Dane, a farm boy from the agricultural districts who had learned to shoot by hunting the mutant vermin that plagued the grain silos. His aim was supernatural. In his hands, a standard-issue lasgun became a precision instrument capable of placing shots through gaps measured in centimeters at distances exceeding regulation maximums. They were joined by Petra Voss, a former White Shield who had earned her place among the regulars during the siege of Tyrok Fields. She had been 14 when the Chaos Space Marines of the Iron Warriors breached the outer defenses. While veteran guardsmen fell back in ordered retreat, Voss had remained at her post, feeding ammunition to a heavy bolter crew that was being systematically eliminated by enemy snipers. When the last gunner died, she had taken control of the weapon herself. For 6 hours, she held a corridor that should have been defended by a full platoon. Her only companions were the dead and the voice of the Emperor speaking in her heart. The medic was a quiet man named Felix Harrow. Before the war claimed him, he had been studying to become a physician on one of Cadia's civilian stations. The Chaos incursions had ended those dreams abruptly. His medical training proved more valuable on the battlefield than in any hospital. Harrow could perform surgery with artillery shells exploding overhead and his hands steady as stone. He had saved lives in conditions that would have challenged the chirurgeons of the Officio Medici. His success rate was remarkable not because of his skill alone, but because he understood something that many medics never learned. Sometimes, the greatest mercy was knowing when to let go. These were the soldiers who held Tertius 77 Alpha, men and women forged in the fires of the Long War, tempered by losses that would have broken lesser souls. They maintained their equipment with religious devotion and performed their duties with mechanical precision. Every morning, they conducted equipment inspections that would have satisfied a tech priest. Every evening, they gathered for evening prayers that honored not only the Emperor, but the fallen comrades whose names were inscribed on the walls of their barracks. The relay station itself was a monument to Imperial engineering philosophy. Built to last millennia, it resembled a tomb more than a communications facility. The main structure was sunk 40 meters into the bedrock, surrounded by defensive positions that could withstand direct hits from orbital bombardments. The communications array rose from the center like the spire of a cathedral, its transmitters capable of punching signals through the worst warp storms. Power was provided by a geothermal tap that drew energy from the planet's molten core. Water came from ice mines dug into the polar deposits. Food was supplied by automated dropships that arrived every 6 months with crates of Korps starch and protein bars that tasted like cardboard soaked in promethium. Life at the relay followed patterns established by Cadian military doctrine and refined by 3 years of isolation. Revi at 500 hours, followed by physical training that would have challenged Space Marine neophytes. Equipment maintenance occupied the morning hours, with each soldier responsible for their personal weapons and a portion of the station's defensive systems. The afternoon was dedicated to patrol duties, with teams of 2 or 3 soldiers conducting sweeps of the perimeter that extended 15 kilometers from the main facility. The evenings belonged to education and remembrance. Verin conducted tactical seminars where the squad studied historical battles and analyzed enemy weaknesses. Thane led discussions of Imperial doctrine, ensuring that every soldier understood not just what they were fighting for, but why the fight mattered. Harrow provided medical training that went beyond basic field surgery. In the event of total communications failure, each member of the squad would be capable of treating injuries that would normally require hospitalization. But it was the remembrance ceremonies that truly defined life at Tertius 77 Alpha. Every night, the squad gathered in the common room to recite the names of fallen comrades. The list was long. It began with friends lost during their first deployment to the agri-world of Thanatos Prime, where orc raiders had turned fertile farmland into a charnel house. It continued through the brutal urban warfare on Hive-world Mordax, where they had fought chaos cultists in tunnels filled with toxic gas and the screams of the damned. The names accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of loss that formed the foundation of their identity. They were Cadian. They endured. The first sign that their isolation was ending came on a Tuesday morning during the third year of their deployment. Voss was conducting a routine patrol of Sector 7 when her Vox unit crackled with an automated distress signal. The transmission was brief and heavily corrupted by interference, but the message was unmistakable. An Imperial vessel was requesting emergency assistance approximately 200 kilometers to the northwest. The signal repeated every 30 seconds, suggesting that the ship's crew was either dead or incapacitated. Verin made the decision to investigate without consulting higher command. This was partly due to Imperial doctrine, which required all available forces to assist in rescue operations. But it was also a recognition of reality. The nearest Imperial base was 6 months away by conventional transport. If there were survivors aboard the downed vessel, they would be dead long before reinforcements arrived. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops were the only help available. The journey to the crash site took 2 days across terrain that would have challenged an experienced mountaineer. Kolos Prime was a world of extremes. During the day, temperatures could reach levels that would cook unprotected flesh in minutes. At night, they dropped to depths that could freeze blood in human veins. The squad traveled during the dawn and dusk hours, when the temperature was merely hostile rather than lethal. They moved in standard patrol formation, with Dane and Voss serving as advance scouts, while the main body followed at a distance of 500 meters. The crashed vessel revealed itself gradually, like a corpse emerging from shallow water. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a dark smudge against the horizon. As they drew closer, details resolved into a picture of catastrophic destruction. The ship had been a light cruiser of ancient design, its hull bearing the scars of weapons fire that had penetrated void shields and armor plating. The impact had driven the vessel nearly 100 meters into the planet's surface, creating a crater that resembled a meteor strike. Emergency beacons were still functioning, powered by backup generators that would continue operating for weeks without maintenance, but there was no response to Vox communications. No signs of life among the twisted wreckage. Verin ordered a careful approach, with weapons ready and eyes scanning for any indication of survivors or threats. What they found instead was something far worse than death. The ship's crew had not died in the crash, they had been changed. The bodies scattered throughout the wreckage showed signs of mutation that could only have come from prolonged exposure to chaos influence. Some had grown additional limbs that ended in claws or tentacles. Others had developed sensory organs in impossible places, eyes sprouting from shoulders or mouths opening in the center of chest cavities. The changes followed no rational pattern, as if reality itself had become fluid and malleable around the vessel. In the captain's quarters, they found a logbook that told the story of the ship's final voyage. The vessel had been traveling through the maelstrom, carrying a cargo manifest that had been classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. 3 weeks into the journey, the ship had encountered warp storms of unprecedented severity. The Geller field had flickered, allowing the merest touch of the Imperium to caress the vessel's hull. That touch had been enough. The mutations had begun slowly. A crewman reported strange dreams. Another complained of voices whispering in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. Within days, the changes had become physical. Skin began to shift and flow like water. Bones reformed themselves into new configurations. The ship's commander had tried to maintain order, but how do you discipline crew members who no longer possess human vocal cords? The final entry in the logbook was a single line, written in a hand that shook with madness or terror. The Emperor protects, but from what? Harrow examined the bodies with the clinical detachment of a trained medic. His conclusion was unambiguous. The mutations were not random, but followed patterns that suggested intelligent design. Something had been reshaping these people according to a plan that human minds could not comprehend. The process had been ongoing for months, perhaps years before the crash. The vessel had become a laboratory where the laws of biology were rewritten according to the whims of entities that existed beyond the boundaries of sanity. More disturbing was his secondary finding: the mutations were still active. Despite the fact that the crew had been dead for weeks, their bodies continued to change. Flesh rippled with motion that had nothing to do with decomposition. New growths emerged from corpses that should have been reduced to bone and dry tissue. Whatever force had claimed the ship remained present, working its will upon matter that no longer possessed the spark of life. Verin ordered an immediate withdrawal. The ship and its cargo were beyond salvation. The only course of action was to return to the relay station and report their findings to higher command. With luck, an Inquisition team could be dispatched to contain the corruption before it spread beyond the crash site. Such hope proved to be optimistic. The corruption had already found them. Dane was the first to show symptoms. During the journey back to Tertius 77 Alpha, he began complaining of headaches that seemed to originate behind his eyes. The pain was accompanied by visual disturbances that he described as seeing things that weren't there, shapes moving at the periphery of his vision, shadows that fell in directions that defied the position of the sun, colors that had no names in any human language. Harrow administered standard painkillers and ordered additional rest periods, but the symptoms persisted. By the time they reached the relay station, Dane was reporting auditory hallucinations. Voices calling his name from empty corridors, music that seemed to come from inside his skull. Whispers in languages that sounded almost familiar, but carried meanings that made his soul ache with longing for things he could not identify. The medical examination revealed nothing abnormal. Dane's vital signs were stable, his reflexes remained sharp. Blood tests showed no indication of infection or toxicity, yet something was clearly wrong. The man who had once been capable of threading bullets through needle eyes now struggled to hit targets at point-blank range. His legendary marksmanship, honed through decades of constant practice, had abandoned him without explanation. Verin made the decision to quarantine Dane in the station's medical bay. This was a precaution born of experience rather than protocol. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops had encountered chaos corruption before. They understood that the enemy's greatest weapon was not firepower or numbers, but the ability to turn humanity's strengths against itself. A single corrupted individual could destroy a regiment more effectively than a company of space marines. But quarantine measures proved inadequate when the corruption existed not in flesh, but in perception itself. On the third night after their return, Corvin reported equipment malfunctions in the communications array. Routine diagnostic procedures revealed nothing wrong with the hardware, yet the transmitters continued to emit signals that bore no resemblance to standard Imperial codes. The emissions were complex patterns of static that seemed to contain hidden meanings, like messages encoded in the language of dying stars. Technical analysis provided no answers. The equipment functioned perfectly according to every test that Corvin could devise. Power consumption remained within normal parameters. Signal strength was optimal. Yet the nature of the transmissions had changed in ways that defied rational explanation. Instead of the crisp digital signals required for interstellar communication, the array was broadcasting analog patterns that resembled nothing so much as the electroencephalographic readings of a dreaming mind. Verin ordered the communications array to be shut down until the malfunction could be identified and corrected. This decision proved to be a mistake. Without the constant background hum of the transmitters, the silence at Tertius 77 Alpha became absolute. In that silence, they began to hear things that should not have existed. The sounds came at night when the station's environmental systems reduced their activity to conserve power. Footsteps in empty corridors, conversations in rooms that had been unoccupied for hours. The whisper of pages turning in books that contained no words. These auditory phenomena were not random but followed patterns that suggested purpose. They seemed to be searching for something, methodically exploring every corner of the facility like an invisible presence conducting a thorough inspection. Thane volunteered to investigate. As second in command, he considered it his duty to confront threats that might be beyond the capability of his subordinates. Armed with a handheld Auspex and a compactless pistol, he began nocturnal patrols of the station's interior spaces. The readings he collected were disturbing but inconclusive. The Auspex detected motion in areas where nothing visible moved. Temperature fluctuations occurred without apparent cause. Electromagnetic fields shifted according to patterns that bore no relationship to the station's electrical systems. More troubling were the personal effects he discovered during these investigations. Items that belonged to crew members who had died years earlier appeared in places where they could not logically exist. A watch that had been buried with its owner on the battlefields of Mordax was found ticking on a table in the common room. A letter from a sweetheart killed during the Orc invasion of Thanatos Prime materialized in Thane's own quarters, written in handwriting he recognized despite the impossibility of its existence. These manifestations were not mere hallucinations. Other squad members could see and touch the displaced objects. They possessed weight and substance, obeying the laws of physics in every measurable way. Yet their presence violated causality itself. How could items destroyed or buried on distant worlds appear inside a sealed facility on Colossus Prime? The question had no rational answer, which suggested that rationality itself might no longer apply. Harrow proposed a medical explanation. Prolonged exposure to the chaos-tainted wreckage had triggered latent psychic abilities in one or more squad members. The human mind possessed depths that Imperial science had never fully mapped. Under extreme stress, some individuals developed the capacity to manipulate reality through unconscious psionic activity. The displaced objects were not supernatural phenomena, but manifestations of repressed memories given physical form through psychic projection. The theory was plausible and terrifying in equal measure. If correct, it meant that one of their own had become a conduit for warp energy. Such individuals were extraordinarily dangerous, capable of triggering demonic incursions or reality storms that could devastate entire planets. Imperial doctrine was unambiguous regarding the proper response to unsanctioned psychers. They were to be terminated immediately, without trial or hesitation. But who among them had been chosen by the warp? The symptoms affected everyone to some degree. All reported strange dreams and sensory disturbances. All had discovered personal items that should not exist. The corruption was not localized to a single individual but had infected the entire squad like a spiritual contagion. Executing one person would accomplish nothing if the others remained compromised. Verin faced an impossible choice. She could order the execution of her entire command, including herself, to prevent the corruption from spreading beyond Tertius 77 Alpha. This would be the decision of a by-the-book officer trained to prioritize the Imperium's survival over individual lives. Alternatively, she could hope that the manifestations would fade with time, allowing her soldiers to return to normal duty. This path risked not only their souls, but the safety of every Imperial citizen in the sector. The decision was taken from her by events beyond anyone's control. On the 7th night after their return from the crash site, the dead began to walk. The first sighting occurred during Voss's watch in the communication center. She was attempting to restore the transmitter array when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the corridor lighting. The shape was human but wrong in ways that her mind struggled to process. Too tall, too thin. Moving with motions that resembled a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. She called out, expecting to receive an answer from one of her squad mates. Instead, the figure turned toward her with a motion that involved far too many joints. In the space where a face should have been, there was only darkness. Not the darkness of shadow or concealment, but an absence of light so complete that it seemed to devour the illumination around it. When it spoke, the voice belonged to someone who had been dead for 3 years. "Petra," it said, using the exact inflection and accent of Corporal Jack Henner, killed during the evacuation of Hive Tertius. "You left me behind." The accusation struck her like a physical blow. During the retreat from the collapsing hive, she had indeed been forced to abandon wounded comrades who could not be evacuated. The decision had been tactically sound and morally necessary. Carrying the injured would have slowed the entire squad, resulting in additional casualties. But sound tactics provided no comfort when the faces of the abandoned haunted her dreams. She reached for her sidearm, training taking precedence over confusion. The weapon cleared its holster in a motion practiced 10,000 times, muscle memory functioning even as her conscious mind reeled from impossibility. But before she could fire, the figure dissolved like smoke touched by wind. Only empty air remained where the apparition had stood. Voss reported the incident immediately, using the station's internal Vox system to alert the entire squad. Her transmission was answered not by her living comrades but by voices she recognized as belonging to the dead. Names from the remembrance ceremonies spoke from empty rooms, their words carrying across frequencies that should have been secure. They offered greetings, asked about mutual friends, and complained about conditions in whatever realm they now inhabited. The phenomenon spread throughout the facility with the speed of wildfire. In every corridor and chamber, the living encountered phantoms of those they had failed to save. The ghosts were not universally hostile. Many seemed genuinely pleased to renew contact with their former squad mates. They shared jokes, recalled shared experiences, and provided updates on their current circumstances that ranged from amusing to disturbing. Former Sergeant Molk Theron, killed by Orc artillery on Thanatos Prime, complained that death was boring as hell and asked if anyone had remembered to feed his pet groks back on Cadia. Trooper Elena Vask, who had died of infected wounds during the retreat from Mordax, wanted to know if her favorite low-stick brand was still available in the commissary. Private John Kellect, bisected by a Chaos Space Marines chainsword during the siege of Tyrok Fields, cheerfully reported that dismemberment was not as bad as you'd think once you got used to it. These conversations would have been disturbing under any circumstances. What made them unbearable was their accuracy. The dead possessed knowledge they should not have had. They knew about events that had occurred after their deaths, relationships that had developed in their absence, and personal details that had never been shared with anyone. It was as if death had not separated them from the living, but had instead granted them a broader perspective on existence. Harrow attempted to apply medical reasoning to the phenomenon. Mass hallucinations were not unknown among soldiers subjected to extreme stress. The human mind possessed remarkable capacity for self-deception, particularly when confronted with guilt or trauma that exceeded its ability to process rationally. What appeared to be supernatural visitations could be explained as collective psychological break, triggered by their exposure to the chaos-tainted wreckage. But the ghosts possessed physical presence that extended beyond mere visual manifestation. They could manipulate objects, leaving fingerprints on surfaces and expending ammunition from weapons they had no right to touch. Security recordings captured their movements, proving that the apparitions existed independently of human perception. Whatever force had brought them into being operated according to rules that transcended psychology. The situation deteriorated rapidly. communication with the outside galaxy became impossible as the transmitter array began broadcasting the voices of the dead across every frequency. Supply delivery ceased when dropship pilots reported hearing their own voices requesting permission to land, though they had not transmitted any such requests. The station's automated systems began responding to commands issued by personnel who had been dead for years. Within a week, Tertius 77 Alpha had become a monument to the permeable boundary between life and death. The living shared their duties with the dead, working alongside phantoms who remembered their training with perfect clarity. Guard rotations included soldiers who cast no shadows. Equipment maintenance was performed by technicians whose hands passed through matter at unpredictable intervals. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of new guests. They came without warning on a night when the aurora borealis painted the sky in shades of green and gold. Their approach was heralded not by engine noise or vox transmissions, but by the sudden silence of the dead. One moment, the station bustled with the activity of 2 squads working in perfect coordination. The next, only the living remained, alone in chambers that suddenly felt vast and empty. The visitors announced themselves with a transmission that bypassed the communications array entirely, speaking directly into the minds of everyone present. The voice was warm and paternal, carrying undertones of infinite compassion and boundless wisdom. It offered greetings in the name of powers that desired only humanity's enlightenment and prosperity. All that was required in exchange was acknowledgement of their sovereignty over the material realm. Verin's response was immediate and unambiguous. She activated the station's emergency beacon and ordered her squad to battle stations. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops had not survived decades of warfare by accepting convenient offers from unknown entities. If these visitors desired entry to Tertius 77 Alpha, they would have to take it by force. The assault began with psychological warfare designed to undermine the defenders' resolve. The attackers projected images directly into human minds, showing each defender visions of their deepest fears and most shameful secrets. Verin saw herself as a child, cowering in a bunker, while Chaos Space Marines butchered her family. Thane experienced the trial of iron resolve again, but this time the coffin walls closed inward until they crushed his body to pulp. Each vision was crafted to exploit personal vulnerabilities that no external observer should have known. But the Cadians had been trained to resist such attacks. From childhood, they had practiced mental exercises designed to shield their thoughts from psychic intrusion. They recited litanies of hatred that focused their anger into weapons sharper than any blade. When fear threatened to overwhelm them, they remembered the faces of fallen comrades who had died rather than submit to the enemy's will. The attackers adapted their strategy with disturbing speed. Unable to break the defenders' minds through fear, they began offering rewards instead of punishment. Each Cadian was shown visions of what they could become if they accepted the visitors' patronage. Enhanced strength that would make them unstoppable in combat. Perfect marksmanship that would never miss its target. Medical knowledge that could resurrect the dead and heal any wound. These temptations were more dangerous than any threat. Every soldier dreamed of becoming something greater than human limitations allowed. The prospect of transcending mortality and achieving perfection appealed to desires buried so deeply that most people never acknowledged their existence. Several members of the squad began to waver, their resistance weakening as they contemplated lives free from pain and failure. It was Dane who broke first. The marksman stepped away from his position and walked toward the station's main entrance with the mechanical precision of a sleepwalker. His weapon remained in his hands, but his finger had moved away from the trigger. When Verin called his name, he turned to face her with eyes that reflected light like polished metal. "They're offering me my sight back," he said in a voice devoid of emotion. "Perfect vision. I'll never miss again. The promise revealed the depth of his private torment. Dane's legendary marksmanship had been compromised by his exposure to the chaos-tainted wreckage, reducing him from a precision instrument to merely competent. For a man whose identity was built upon superhuman accuracy, the loss was equivalent to spiritual death. The visitors offered not just restoration, but enhancement beyond anything human genetics could achieve. Verin shot him without hesitation. The last bolt took Dane in the center of his chest, burning through his flak armor and stopping his heart instantly. He fell backward onto the station's metal flooring with the sound of meat striking stone. For a moment, his expression showed surprise rather than pain. Then his eyes clouded over, and Marcus Dane, finest marksman of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops, died as he had lived, serving the Emperor's will. The execution served its purpose. Whatever influence the visitors had exerted over Dane was severed by his death. The remaining defenders felt the psychic pressure lessen, as if a weight they had not realized they were carrying had been lifted from their shoulders. But the attackers had learned valuable information about their opponent's capabilities and weaknesses. The second assault came without warning or preparation. One moment, the squad was maintaining defensive positions throughout the station. The next, they found themselves standing in a vast chamber that had not existed seconds before. The walls stretched upward beyond the reach of any illumination, disappearing into darkness that seemed to possess weight and substance. The floor beneath their feet was polished black stone that reflected their images with perfect clarity. At the center of the chamber stood a figure that hurt to perceive directly. It wore the shape of a tall human draped in robes that seemed to be cut from concentrated starlight. Where its face should have been, there was a void that contained swirling galaxies and dying suns. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority of creation itself. "Children of the Korps, God," it said, each word causing reality to ripple like water disturbed by thrown stones. "Your resistance is admirable but pointless. Accept our gifts willingly and ascend beyond your mortal limitations. Refuse and be consumed by forces beyond your comprehension." The entity gestured with one hand, and Corvin screamed. Her body began to change, flesh flowing like liquid as her limbs stretched and multiplied. Additional arms sprouted from her torso, each ending in hands that possessed too many fingers. Her face elongated into something that resembled a canine snout, complete with fangs that gleamed like polished obsidian. The transformation was not random but followed patterns that suggested intelligent design. "Behold," the entity continued, "the gift of perfection. Your comrade has been freed from the limitations of human form. She can now serve purposes beyond the narrow scope of mortality." But Corvin was still Corvin. Despite the radical alterations to her body, her mind remained intact and furious. She raised one of her new arms, which now ended in claws capable of rending ceramite, and made a gesture that would have gotten her executed for insubordination under any other circumstances. When she spoke, her voice was unchanged despite the transformation of her vocal cords. "Kiss my ass, you tentacled freak." The entity's response was immediate and terrible. Corvin's body began to tear itself apart, each limb moving in a different direction with enough force to pulp bone and shred muscle. But instead of dying, she regenerated faster than the damage could accumulate. Flesh knitted itself back together, even as it was being destroyed, creating a cycle of death and rebirth that could theoretically continue forever. The demonstration was intended to break the remaining defenders' will. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Watching their comrades torture, the Cadians felt something more powerful than fear or despair. They felt rage, pure, undiluted hatred for enemies who would corrupt and torment rather than simply kill. This anger was not weakness but strength, a flame that burned away doubt and replaced it with crystalline purpose. Harrow moved first, launching himself at the entity with a surgical scalpel in each hand. The weapons were pathetically inadequate against a being of such power, but his attack served as a catalyst for the others. Voss opened fire with her lasgun, sending coherent light streaming toward the figure's center mass. Thane activated a frag grenade and hurled it with an accuracy that would have impressed a space marine. Their assault accomplished nothing against the entity itself. La bolts passed through its form without causing visible damage. The grenade exploded harmlessly against what appeared to be empty air. But their defiance had consequences that extended beyond physical combat. The chamber began to shake, its walls cracking as reality reasserted itself against the intrusion of alien logic. The entity laughed, a sound like solar winds passing through the void between stars, but there was something forced about its amusement, as if the situation was not unfolding according to plan. When it spoke again, its voice carried undertones of frustration that had not been present before. Your loyalty to a dead god is touching but meaningless. The Emperor has abandoned you to die on a forgotten world, fighting enemies that will devour your souls and scatter your atoms across the void. What has such devotion earned you except pain and solitude? The question was meant to plant seeds of doubt that would undermine their resistance. Instead, it reminded the Cadians of fundamental truths that had guided their entire lives. They had never expected rewards for their service. They had never sought recognition for their sacrifices. They fought not because victory was certain, but because defeat was unthinkable. The Emperor protected not because he owed them protection, but because they had proven themselves worthy of his notice. Verin stepped forward, her laspistol trained on the entity's approximate center mass. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had never learned to doubt her purpose. The Emperor protects, she said, each word pronounced with the precision of a prayer. Not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, but because we stand between humanity and the dark. You can corrupt our flesh and torment our minds, but you cannot touch what makes us human, and as long as one of us draws breath, we will resist. The entity's laughter ceased abruptly. For the first time since its arrival, it seemed genuinely surprised by their response. It had expected fear, desperation, or bargaining. What it encountered instead was implacable determination backed by faith that transcended rational thought. These humans would not be turned or broken because they had already sacrificed everything that could be taken from them. The chamber began to collapse, its impossible architecture crumbling as the entity's concentration faltered. Reality reasserted itself with violent force, snapping back into configurations that obeyed natural law. The Cadians found themselves once again in the familiar confines of Tertia 77 Alpha, surrounded by walls of honest concrete and ceramite. But they were not alone. The station was filled with figures that glowed with soft golden light. These were not the ghosts of their fallen comrades, but something else entirely. Angels, perhaps, or the spirits of saints who had died in the Emperor's service. They moved with purpose and grace, their presence driving back shadows that had never existed until that moment. Where they touched corrupted surfaces, purity returned. Equipment that had malfunctioned began operating normally. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the facility lifted like fog dispersed by morning sunlight. One of the luminous figures approached Verin. When it spoke, its voice carried overtones of authority that made the entity's pronouncements seem like the whimpering of spoiled children. Well done, faithful servants. Your resistance has been noted by those who keep watch over humanity's defenders. The corruption that sought to claim this place has been purged, but vigilance must be maintained. The enemy never sleeps, and neither can those who stand against it. The figure gestured toward Corvin, whose transformed body had been restored to its original configuration. She stood exactly as she had before the entity's intervention, her flesh unmarked by the tortures she had endured. Even her uniform had been repaired, showing no evidence of the violence that had been inflicted upon her. Yet something in her eyes suggested that she remembered every moment of agony with perfect clarity. "The wounded shall be made whole," the luminous being continued. "The corrupted shall be cleansed, but the price of purity is eternal vigilance. What you have witnessed here is but a shadow of the darkness that waits beyond the light of terror. Remember this night. Remember what you have seen. And never forget that the enemy's greatest victory is convincing humanity that it does not exist." The angels began to fade as dawn approached, their forms becoming translucent before dissolving entirely. But their presence left changes that would endure long after their departure. The station's equipment functioned with efficiency that exceeded factory specifications. The walls themselves seemed to radiate warmth and security. Even the planet's harsh climate appeared to moderate, as if Colossus Prime had been touched by benediction from distant terror. In the days that followed, life at Tertius 77 Alpha returned to patterns that resembled normalcy. The communications array resumed its proper function, transmitting and receiving signals across the galaxy with crystalline clarity. Supply drops arrived on schedule, bringing fresh rations and replacement equipment. The automated systems operated without malfunction or mystery. But the dead no longer walked the station's corridors. The familiar voices that had provided comfort and companionship were gone, leaving behind a silence that felt absolute. The living had been returned to their proper realm, separated from those who had passed beyond by boundaries that could not be crossed through will or desire alone. The squad conducted their remembrance ceremonies with renewed solemnity, knowing that the names they recited belonged to souls who had found peace in whatever realm awaited the faithful. Verin filed her report with the same mechanical precision she brought to all administrative duties. The official record stated that the 47th Cadian Shock Troops had investigated a crashed Imperial vessel, discovered evidence of chaos corruption, and implemented appropriate containment procedures. The supernatural manifestations were classified as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by exposure to warp-tainted materials. The entity's appearance was described as a shared psychotic episode triggered by prolonged isolation and combat fatigue. The report was accepted without question by officers who had never set foot on a battlefield, filed in archives that would never be examined by anyone with the authority to act upon its contents. Added to the vast accumulation of documentation that formed the Imperium's institutional memory, another incident processed and forgotten by minds that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. 3 months later, a new assignment arrived via encrypted transmission. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops were to be transferred to Agri-World Demeter VII, where Orc raiders had been conducting strikes against food production facilities. The deployment would require a 6-month journey through warp space, followed by an indefinite period of garrison duty on a world where the primary threats were feral groks and equipment failures. The squad prepared for transfer with the same methodical approach they brought to all military operations. Equipment was cleaned, inspected, and packed according to regulations that had been refined through centuries of Imperial expansion. Personal effects were secured in containers designed to survive void ship emergencies. Final maintenance checks were performed on systems that would continue operating long after their departure. On their last night at Tertius 77 Alpha, the squad gathered in the common room for a final remembrance ceremony. The list of names had grown by one. Marcus Dane, finest marksman of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops, who had died serving the Emperor's will. His name was added to the litany with the same reverence accorded to every fallen comrade, spoken aloud so that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. As they recited the familiar words, something shifted in the air around them. Not the oppressive presence they had felt during the entity's visit, but something gentler and more familiar. For just a moment, they could have sworn they heard additional voices joining their ceremony. Phantom sounds that might have been whined through ventilation ducts or the settling of cooling metal. Sounds that resembled human speech shaped into words of remembrance and farewell. But when they strained to listen more carefully, there was only silence. The transport arrived at dawn, its hull scarred by decades of service in the Emperor's fleets. The pilot was a grizzled veteran who had seen enough worlds to know when not to ask questions. He accepted the squad's gear without comment and provided them with acceleration couches that showed the wear of countless previous passengers. The departure was routine, unremarkable, and efficient. As Colossus Prime fell away beneath them, Verin watched through a viewport until the planet became just another star in the vast constellation of Imperial worlds. Somewhere on its surface, Tertia 77 Alpha continued its automated functions, maintaining equipment that no longer served any purpose. The communications array transmitted its signals into void that had no one left to answer. The defensive positions remained alert for enemies that would never come. She wondered if the station remembered them, if buildings could retain impressions of those who had lived and died within their walls. If the very stones bore witness to acts of courage and sacrifice that would never be recorded in any official history, such thoughts were superstitious nonsense, unbefitting a rational soldier of the Imperial Guard. Yet she could not shake the feeling that they had left something important behind on that frozen world. The journey to Demeter 7 passed without incident. The Geller field held steady through warp translations that should have tested even veteran crews. The ship's systems functioned with reliability that impressed the tech priests responsible for their maintenance. Morale remained high among passengers who had expected a voyage filled with the usual hazards of warp travel. Too high, perhaps, too convenient, too perfect in every measurable detail. During the third week of their journey, Harrow began conducting medical examinations that revealed disturbing patterns. Every member of the squad showed signs of cellular regeneration that exceeded normal human parameters. Wounds that should have left permanent scars had healed without trace. Dental work performed years earlier had been restored to perfect condition. Even genetic markers associated with aging had been reversed or eliminated entirely. The changes were subtle enough to escape casual observation, but profound enough to suggest fundamental alterations to their biological nature. They were still human in every way that mattered, but they had become something more than human limitations typically allowed. Stronger, faster, more resilient to damage and disease. Enhanced in ways that should have required decades of surgical modification or genetic therapy. When confronted with the evidence, none of them could remember when the improvements had begun. The changes felt natural, as if they had always possessed these capabilities. Their enhanced reflexes and improved endurance seemed like recovered memories rather than new acquisitions. It was only through careful comparison with their medical records that the alterations became apparent. Corvin discovered additional modifications while performing routine equipment maintenance. Her hands had developed sensitivity to electromagnetic fields that allowed her to diagnose mechanical problems through touch alone. She could feel the flow of current through circuits and detect metal fatigue before it became visible to conventional inspection. These abilities were far beyond anything that normal human senses could achieve. Voss found that her aim had improved to levels that approached Dane's legendary marksmanship. She could place shots with precision that defied statistical probability, threading bullets through gaps that should have been impossible to hit. Her reflexes had accelerated to the point where she could track individual raindrops during heavy storms. Most disturbing was Thane's discovery that he could sense the emotional states of those around him. Not through observation of facial expressions or body language, but through some form of direct perception that bypassed his normal senses entirely. He could feel Varin's determination as a physical weight, taste Harrow's curiosity like metal on his tongue, smell the lingering traces of fear that clung to all of them like smoke. These enhancements were not random mutations but purposeful modifications designed to make them more effective soldiers. Someone or something had improved their capabilities while leaving their fundamental humanity intact. The question was whether this transformation was reward or preparation. Were they being honored for their faithful service or equipped for trials that would require abilities beyond normal human limits? The answer came during their final week of warp travel, when the ship's sensors detected an anomaly that should not have existed. Long-range Auspex readings showed a massive object moving through the void at speeds that violated known laws of physics. The signature was unlike anything in Imperial databases, suggesting technology that originated from sources beyond human understanding. The captain ordered evasive maneuvers, but the entity matched their course changes with ease. It approached the transport with the deliberate patience of a predator stalking wounded prey. When it finally revealed itself on visual scanners, the bridge crew fell silent in recognition of something that belonged in nightmare rather than reality. The thing was vast beyond easy comprehension, its hull stretching across distances that should have housed entire cities. Its surface was covered with growths that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns too complex for human minds to process. Sensor readings suggested that it was simultaneously organic and mechanical, as if some ancient intelligence had merged flesh with technology to create hybrid abominations. But most terrifying was the realization that the entity was not alone. Long-range sensors detected additional contacts moving through the void in formations that suggested intelligence and purpose. They were heading toward Imperial space with the methodical determination of an invasion fleet. Their estimated time of arrival at the nearest inhabited system was measured in months rather than years. The transport's captain made the only decision available to him. He ordered an immediate translation back to real space and transmitted an emergency signal to the nearest Imperial facility. The warning would take weeks to reach its destination, but it might provide enough advance notice for defensive preparations. At best, the Imperium would have time to evacuate civilian populations and position military assets where they could inflict maximum damage on the approaching enemy. At worst, the warning would be ignored by officers who refused to believe reports that contradicted their understanding of reality. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops reached Demeter VII without further incident. They were assigned to garrison duty at a military depot that protected food shipments bound for nearby hive worlds. Their duties were routine and undemanding, involving nothing more dangerous than preventing theft by local wildlife and maintaining equipment that rarely required attention. But their nights were filled with dreams that felt more like memories. Visions of battles fought on worlds that had not yet been discovered. Glimpses of enemies that wore shapes borrowed from humanity's deepest fears. Previews of a war that would make their previous campaigns seem like minor skirmishes by comparison. During the day, they performed their assigned duties with mechanical efficiency. During the night, they prepared for conflicts that existed only in shared nightmares. They cleaned weapons that would never be fired in anger on this peaceful world. They practiced tactics designed for enemies that did not yet exist. They maintained readiness for deployment orders that might never come. The modifications to their bodies continued to manifest in subtle ways. Enhanced healing that left no scars. Improved reflexes that made routine tasks feel sluggish. Senses sharpened to levels that bordered on precognition. They were becoming something more than human, but the transformation felt like regression rather than evolution. As if they were returning to capabilities that humanity had once possessed, but had forgotten through disuse. 6 months into their deployment, Varin received new orders via classified transmission. The 47th Cadian Shock Troops were to report for immediate reassignment to a facility whose location was classified above her security clearance. Transportation would be provided by vessels under Inquisition authority. All current duties were to be transferred to replacement personnel within 72 hours. The orders were signed by authorities she had never heard of, using seals that carried power beyond anything in her experience. This was not a routine military transfer, but something far more significant. They were being summoned by individuals who operated in shadows beyond the reach of normal Imperial hierarchy. As they prepared for departure, Harrow made a final discovery that cast their situation in new light. Hidden within their medical files were genetic markers that should not have existed in baseline human DNA. Sequences that resembled coding rather than natural evolution. Patterns that suggested their modifications had been planned and implemented by intelligence that possessed understanding of human biology far exceeding Imperial medical science. They were no longer merely enhanced soldiers, but prototypes of something new, living experiments designed to test the limits of human potential. The question was whether they had been improved for their own benefit or to serve purposes that existed beyond their comprehension. The answer would come soon enough. The galaxy was changing in ways that would require humanity to evolve or face extinction. Ancient threats were stirring in the void between stars, preparing to reclaim territories they had abandoned eons ago. The war that was coming would be fought not between armies, but between different concepts of what life itself should become. And in the darkness between sleeping and waking, Varen could hear something calling her name, not with the voice of the dead or the whispers of corruption, but with words that carried the weight of absolute authority. Commands issued by entities that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space, instructions for battles that would determine whether humanity had any future at all. She closed her eyes and listened to sounds that had no source, prepared for deployment to places that had no names, ready to fight enemies that wore familiar faces but possessed souls carved from alien nightmares. The Emperor protects, she reminded herself as sleep finally claimed her. But even the Emperor could not protect against threats that came from within humanity itself. In her dreams, she saw Cadia burning, but this time it was not falling to external invasion but transforming into something that had never been human at all.